What's happening, fam? L.A.R. movement still moving. Subscribe or die trying. You see the thumbnail. Let's talk about the 1990s. I'm a little disgusted by this revisionist history and how people who were young adults and teenagers in the 90s, somehow now, when you're in your 40s or even late 30s, somehow you got this revisionist history. And I got to get to the bottom of these shenanigans. So, ladies and gentlemen, there were certain areas in America that were violent in the 90s. And when you see these people talking about the drug era and the money being made in the hustlers, that stopped in the 80s. In the 90s, it got exceedingly violent because, for one, the charges went up, the money kind of went down, and how can I say this? It got competitive. So when you see a show like Snowfall and it changes over from Franklin making a whole lot of money to all these warring parties, that's the 90s. So when people talk about how scared they are now of this, that, and the third, it's like, well, the violence in the 90s is worse than what it is 2021. Let's go back to the 90s. How white America can't get over the OJ case. Do y'all realize they just brought back the Ford Bronco like a year ago? Do y'all understand why it was discontinued? Because of the OJ trial. Because OJ was riding on the freeway in a Ford Bronco with AC, not air conditioning, but his best friend. And after that happened, that was like, oh, Ford, we're not making these no more. They discontinued that basically because of that. So, and then let's bring it to the school aspect where the O.J. Simpson trial was in school like March Madness, because March Madness used to be in the schools, during February, March. We used to watch March Madness. But the O.J. trial was the same way. And it came off as a tipping point for America. And at the same time, it came off as a racial experiment, right? Because the teachers were like, it came off like, we want to see what happens. And then it came off like, we're going to show you how we'll do you if you get out of line. And then when it didn't end the way white people saw it, then, people figured black people were celebrating in the streets. Well, we were celebrating because we got tired of y'all playing this in our classroom, acting like, yeah, we'll lock you up, Jimmy. It's like, you know what? That's what I'm talking about. Shut up. And then they had the news cameras, going around. Look at the racial divide in America. Yeah, we knew that already, This is why Johnny Cochran is vilified now, but at the time, it was like, man, he's the coldest lawyer ever. In 1990, Mark Furman was the reason why he got really acquitted. And the lab DNA evidence was why he got acquitted. But, now 30 years later, whatever, now people forget DNA evidence and this, that, and the third. Because it was tampered with. It went from police brutality to police tampering. You see what I'm saying? With evidence. So that's a whole nother story. But that was the 90s. In the 90s, people seem to forget that all of this stuff that we're talking about now with the Me Too movement and what went on back then, and well, we're looking at it like, okay, so what you're trying to tell me is if you were a 2 Live Crew dancer, now all of a sudden I'm supposed to say you were sexually assaulted. If you were one of the women who was chasing around NWA, now I'm supposed to say you were sexually assaulted. If you were one of the women at Freaknik, now we're supposed to say you probably were a victim. And it's like, it's not going to work like that. Or Black Bike Week or Kappa Beach Party or something like that. Now, let's take this a step further. Some of y'all got the story that y'all were abandoned and your daddy didn't love you and this, that, and the third. Some of y'all were made in those type of circumstances and you don't, and somebody lied to you and said your dad was this particular person, they died or they ran away or whatever, but that was the 90s. We knew of that in the 90s. We got to take into consideration how there was a vast difference between the suburbs and the hood in the 90s, in the sense of the hood still had had ethics and morals, just like the suburbs would. But this idea that everybody from a predominantly black neighborhood is a gangster, that really came from music more so than television. Because in the 90s, you got to take into consideration, rock was on television in the 90s. The Parenthood was on television in the 90s. The Cosby Show was still on television in the 90s. Fresh Prince was on television in the 90s. A Different World, 90s. Living Single, 90s. In the House, 90s. What was the show with Damon Wayans? Not Damon Wayans, Sean Wayans. Sean and Marlon. That was the 90s. You know what I'm saying? So they had all these different dynamics in the 90s. I think I said rock. I'm missing a few. But all of these shows had depictions of all black people in black neighborhoods, and it wasn't all violence. And they were in these neighborhoods that were supposed to be violent at times. The vast majority of them. I think the Cosby Show, In the House, and Fresh Prince was the only ones like really, and Family Matters was in Chicago. It was not necessarily the suburbs. It was kind of like the hood offshoot or whatever. But all of this stuff happened at the same time. So when people try to, sagging came from this, that, and the third, don't have all this revisionist history. The gang life, people have a revisionist history. Gangs changed because the leaders were locked up in the 80s, sometimes late 70s. So this idea that, the entrepreneurs and the gangs were this, that, and the third, it's like, no, they were pretty much fractured, broken, and completely dysfunctional in the 90s. There was no leadership and I was in gangs because it's a family environment. That's BS. That's just total BS. So these revisionist stories become a little too extra. But I might delve into this another day also, so just ride with me on this one. Like, share, subscribe, or die trying. Peace.